So welcome everyone. My name is Rabbi Miriam Klimova. I'm a rabbi in Israel, in Haifa, a rabbi of the congregation Shirat Hayam. And today I have the honor of giving a lecture about a fascinating topic. I'm sure you won't believe me because I always say every topic is fascinating, but today I will really try to prove to you that this is a really special, unique, fantastic topic. We'll be talking about the era of Geonim today. And we'll be talking about Shelot Vetshubot, a literary form that stems from this era. These are questions and answers. But before, let's review what we talked about during the previous lecture. Let's put some order. Everyone needs that, both historical, ideological, and when it comes to Jewish history. So, from the earliest times, Judaism regarded the Tanakh as a compendium of rules governing Jewish ritual and civilian behavior. But as we know, times changed and life has changed as well. So when we talk about the Tanakh and about how life continued after it, let's say that the Tanakh, the end of the biblical era, it was around the year 515 BCE. And then life goes on. Everything changes, and we have a system of interpreting and applying these laws, which is emerging. And these are laws that were often presented in the Tanakh only in a broad outline. So we need additional interpretation to make them relevant for our time. Because life keeps on changing. Even 20, 30 years ago, it was different. So I remember that when my sister started her studies in Poland in 1999, she would write me handwritten letters. So we can only imagine how life looked like in those times. 100, 200, 500, 1000 years ago, we know that everything changes. So over time, these interpretations, rulings, and teachings came to be known as halacha. And what is halacha? This word comes from the Hebrew root lalechet, which means walking. So we already sense that it's about something that is changing. And it's unfortunate that today not every Jew can remember that halacha is something that always changes, that it's not something static, not something that stands in one place. The picture you see on the slide is a picture from the Anu Museum in Israel, and it shows a book that is the Torah, and many other books derive from this book. So the other books are subsequent interpretations which are created in every era, in every generation. And this is a reminder of the last lecture. So we had Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi along with his rabbinic colleagues, and they completed the redaction of the Mishnah. So it happened at the end of the 2nd century, the beginning of the 3rd century. So that was the oral Torah, which was now organized and written down. So we have one Torah, Torah Shebichtav, which is the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and Torah Shebe'al Peh, which is the oral Torah. Be'al Peh means to learn something by heart, memorize something. So it's a Torah that's being passed on orally. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was compiling the text. So among many different interpretations, he was choosing one version, or he was selecting one law or regulation to put some order into it. And this was happening orally. At that time, it was not written yet. That happened in the next generations. We talked about this during our last meeting. So during the following 4 to 5 centuries, the rabbis created and developed the classical forms of halakhic thought and literature. So we have the Mishnah from the 1st and 2nd generation, so Tzugot and Tanaim, and they would start to comment the text. The Tzugot era is a time when you only had oral interpretations and you had many different versions. Tanaim are the sages of the Mishnah who lived in Eretz Israel until the beginning of the 3rd century. And after the Tanaim era, we conclude a certain era and we say, okay, now we have a Mishnah. And then we have additional interpretations which are collected in additional writings such as Tosefta, a supplement, and it's a collection of the opinions or views that were not included in the Mishnah. But even besides that, you have additional information because Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi has not compiled everything. And such sources are named Beraita. Beraitot are sources from the same times as the sources used by Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah. And the Talmud is already the next generation, the generation of the Amoraim. So the Talmud is an explanation, a clarification, or something that's complementary to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is written in a very concise style. And its language, sometimes it's not easy to understand. You have laws, regulations, sometimes a story or two, but mainly the law, which is difficult to understand. And that's why you had the next generation, Amoraim, after the compilation of the Mishnah, after the beginning of the 3rd century CE, they start writing new texts, and that is the Talmud. So it refers not just to the Mishnah, sometimes it relies on the commentaries, on the Beraitot, so those that are not present in other sources. But nonetheless, the sages, those who are studying it know that this is related to those times, to that language. And let's remind ourselves that we have two different Talmuds. And why? Because in two different geographical locations, there was work happening. One of them was Eretz Israel, and this Talmud is called Talmud Yerushalmi, so the Jerusalem Talmud. We can translate it into English as exactly the Jerusalem Talmud, Yerushalmi. And the second Talmud, which let me say it's more popular, and today we know why, it's the Babylonian Talmud. It's not hard to understand. The center of Jewish life moved to Babylonia. And if you ask why, I'll give you a very simple reply. Because even in the times when the Talmud was being created, so we had some contacts with the Roman rulers and we were able to come to an understanding with them. But nonetheless, that life wasn't easy. On the other hand, life in Babylonia was much more promising. It was kind of the same like migration to the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. So the migration to Babylonia back in those times was something similar. So as we said, in those times, all these writings are being written. So the Talmud in the Amoraim periods, the Babylonian, the Jerusalem Talmud, and then we have the next era, the Savoraim. So they are working on the Talmud, they are editing it, and they are preparing the final version. So all of them, that's Gad, Tanaim, Amoraim, Savonaim, are called by one name, Chazal, Chachamenu Zichram Livraha, our sages of blessed memory. So we talked about the Mishnah. As we see here, it's been compiled in Eretz Israel. The Jerusalem Talmud was also created there. And then we have the Babylonian Talmud, which was compiled in Babylonia. We can see where it is on the map. It's where today we have Iraq. And here we move on to today's topic, so the next era. Then we had the times of the Geonim. It stems from the title Gaon, which were the heads of the yeshivot in Babylonia. Back then, Babylonia was the spiritual and political center of the Jewish diaspora. So Jewish communities from all over the world were writing letters to Gaons. A Gaon was the head of a yeshiva, a rabbinic academy, and they would ask them various questions on halachic matters. And the term Gaon literally means majesty, pride, authority. And in modern Hebrew, the word Gaon also means genius. So if we translated the word genius into contemporary Hebrew, we would get the word Gaon. So it was the official title of the heads of the yeshivot in two towns, the two largest Jewish centers. So it was Pumbedita, as we can see on the map, and the other one was Sura. So we are in Babylonia now. So from the end of the 7th century until the mid-11th century, the Geonim were regarded as the supreme Jewish authorities on the interpretation of the Talmud and the application of its principles of the Jewish law to the practical questions of daily life. But also when it comes to legal questions related to daily life. So, as we said, we had two main leaders of the Jewish diaspora. So the institutions, the authority was divided into two. So one Gaon, the elevated one, or the head of the yeshiva, so the authority in the yeshiva, so the main rabbi, you could say, so a rabbinic authority, but they were acting in cooperation with another authority, the so-called Resh Galuta, the head of the diaspora. As we know, Resh means the head. That's in Aramaic, the locally spoken language in those times. So most of the Babylonian Talmud, when it comes to original sources, not quotes from previous eras, but original statements of the Babylonian Talmud, are written in Aramaic. So Resh Galuta, that was the head of the diaspora. So what kind of title is it? It was a lay leader, and their authority was oligarchical and political, as one may say. So they had a lot of power, and it was something in between a ruler here on earth, on those lands, and of the whole Jewish people. So the Gaon was selected by the community. They represented the authority of the Torah, and the Resh Galuta, sometimes it's called the exilarch. He was being nominated in a different way. We'll talk about it soon. So usually it was a person who had many connections, who came from a wealthy family, and who was nominated by the authorities in that place, and who ruled in the Geonim period. It was the time of Islam's rule. Islam emerged in the Arabian desert in the early 7th century. So I'm sure you've heard about it. We can imagine it. Prophet Muhammad thought that Islam preceded both Judaism and Christianity and, in fact, encompassed them. The sacred text attributed to Islam, the Quran, contains numerous references to figures and events from the Jewish Tanakh, but also figures from the New Testament, the Christian Bible, from the Talmud, from folklore. So the new religion spread rapidly among the pagan tribes of the desert. And we must understand that in those times we have specific neighbors. So that means that they, as the rulers, can influence us. So the caliphs can decide who will be the Rosh Galuta, and how about the caliphs? Who were they? They were kind of successors of the prophet. So this was the highest authority in Arab states in those times, but it's understood religiously. It's not just a lay ruler, it's the successor of the Prophet Muhammad. So we are in the Geonim period. So how were they elected? In Talmudic times, you already had the idea that you have a Gaon, the head of a yeshiva, a kind of a chief rabbi. So in those times, a Gaon was selected from among the members of the yeshiva. But in the Geonim period, they were being nominated by the Resh Galuta, so the second largest center of power. And usually, before nominating a Gaon, you had consultations with Geonim from the other yeshiva. As we said, we had two. And the Resh Galuta also should accept that nomination. And then, after everyone agreed, it also had to be confirmed by the Caliph. So this is the Islamic rulers who ruled in those times. And then from Sura and Pumbedita, the center of Jewish life moved to Baghdad. So the two yeshivot moved to Baghdad, which was the center of the caliphate. We talk about the Baghdad Caliphate. So the yeshivot moved there in the 10th, 11th century. They moved there completely. So what has this era given us? First of all, it's the literary form named Shalot Utshvot, questions and answers. In Polish and in other languages, we often call this a responsa. So a responsa is an answer, a reply. So Shalot Utshvot, Shut, an abbreviation in Hebrew. So what was it exactly? So this was the writing and spreading of Responsa all across the Jewish world, because the communities of the diaspora were spread apart. And as we said, we had shifting political circumstances and the difficulties of understanding the Talmud. You had many different questions, and it was difficult to find an answer, also due to the changing circumstances, because the situation changed every generation. So Jews in various parts of the dispersion encountered numerous halachic problems. They formulated these questions in writing and sent them to the major yeshivot of Sura and Pumbedita, and the Geonim or their students sent their replies in return. So we literally have Shalot Utshvot. And this describes the whole genre of literature. And this was the main literary activity of that era. Many of these responses have been preserved and published in various collections, which together are known as the Geonic Responsa. Estimates vary, but it's between 4,000 and 10,000 such responses that have survived up to our time. So in addition to their direct significance, their contribution to the development of halacha, the responsa are of immense interest to historians, for the questions addressed to the leading authorities of the time contain countless concrete details reflecting the lifestyle, occupation, social status, and daily realities of Jews in particular communities during specific periods.
Statusu społecznego, codziennego, rzeczywistości żydowskiej
So it reflected the Jewish reality in particular communities and in particular times. What did people ask about? What were they writing about? It turns out that only about 20-30% of the questions focused on matters of daily life. or Chaim. So, how should we get up from bed? What blessing should we say? So, everything that the Talmud deals with, so that a sage can tell us, so now you know you have to do it in such a way. But how about the other 80, 70%? So it was related to law, commerce, finance, divorce, family status, communal governance, and social order. So if you don't have an independent state, someone has to play that role to provide some kind of legal authority for all the Jews, also those who live in the diaspora, not just those from Sura and Pumbedita, not just those living somewhere close to Babylonia, but also to those living in the north of Africa, for example, those who live in the Iberian Peninsula, and in various other places where Jewish communities were being established.
Musimy też zaznaczyć dwie rzeczy dodatkowe. Pierwsze to jest
And let's
hierarchia.
mention two additional things.
Jeżeli nawet ktoś ma
So
pytanie
there was a
w tym
hierarchy.
rozwiązaniu, na
So let's
przykład
say someone has a question. Let's say a
pytanie o
question about
dziedziczenie, pytanie o
inheritance or
rozwód,
about
nie
a
ma szybkiej
divorce.
odpowiedzi i
So
trzeba
there is
się
no
zapytać
simple answer. So you have to ask the
najautorytatowniejszych świadków.
highest
Jak to wszystko
halachic
funkcjonowało?
authority. So how
Człowiek
did it
ma
happen?
problem.
So
Pierwsze,
someone
co
had a
musi zrobić
problem.
w
So
swoim
the first
procesie,
step they had to
na
take,
przykład
let's say they had a problem
Rosenstein.
with someone's
Pierwsze, co musi
will, with the
zrobić, to
inheritance.
pójść
So
do
they had to
Bezdin
go to their
lokalnego,
local Beit
czyli do
Din,
sądu
the
żydowskiego
rabbinical court, the
lokalnego i
local
powiedzieć,
court,
mam taki a
and
taki problem.
tell them, look, I have
Sąd
such and
musi
such
rozwiązać
problem.
ten
And
problem.
the
Sąd żydowski.
Jewish court had to
Jeżeli
solve such a
nie ma
problem.
odpowiedzi
But if
i
it
potrzebuje
did not know how to
pomocy,
solve it,
to
if it
idzie się
needed
do
help,
najwyższej
they
instancji
would
sądowej.
go
Trzeba
to a higher
zapytać się
authority, the
Geonów.
Geonim.
Więc
So as
jest
you
hierarchia.
see, we have a hierarchy.
O co tutaj chodzi? Że człowiek nie może napisać do
So
Gaona.
it's not like any person
Rabin,
could just
do
write
którego
to a
napisał
Gaon.
człowiek, Beit Din,
No,
do którego
you had
napisał
people
człowiek,
writing or
jeżeli
going to
nie
the
ma
Beit Din,
odpowiedzi,
and
musi
only
zwrócić się
then,
do
if
Gaona,
the Beit
do
Din couldn't
najwyższej
answer, couldn't
instancji
resolve the matter on
sądu
its own, then it could
żydowskiego.
submit the question to the
I
higher authority,
rzeczywiście,
to the
drugie
Geonim.
ucho,
And
bardzo
here in the
ważne,
second
płaca
circle,
opłatę.
as was very important in those
Nie
times,
wysyłamy
you had
pytania tak po
to
prostu.
include a fee.
Oczywiście
Of
wszystko to
course,
musi
it
być
wasn't free of
opłacone i
charge.
ta
You have
opłata
to pay
musi
for
przyjść
everything.
wraz
So you
z
had to
pytaniem.
attach a fee to your question.
Jeżeli mówimy o historii i mówimy o tym, kiedy mamy pierwsze wzmianki o Szut,
So if we talk
o
about the
Responsa,
first
to w
instances of
Talmudzie
Shut or
babilońskim już
Responsa,
znajdujemy wzmianki
in the
o
Babylonian Talmud, we
duchowych
already
ośrodkach, które
find
pisemnie
information about spiritual centers that
wysyłali
were sending
odpowiedzi na
answers
pytania
to
kierowane z
questions
różnych
that
miejsc.
they received
W
from many
Talmudzie już to
different places.
znajdujemy,
So the
ale
Talmud
najnowsze
already mentions
zachowane
that,
które
but
właśnie
the
są z epoki Gaonów, nawet
earliest
przypisuje się Rabu
responsa that survived
Szerszym Gaonowi,
from the Geonim
datuje się to
period
na
are dated
połowę
to Rav,
VII wieku. Tak?
are
Czyli
dated
już mamy
to
zachowane takie responsy.
some Rav
Jeżeli
Sherira.
mówimy o
So we
tym,
have
jak to wszystko
some
się toczyło dalej, to tworzenie
responsa which
responsu trwało
survived,
przez cały
and the writing of responsa lasted
epokę
throughout the
Gaonów
whole
i
Geonim
osiągnęło swój
period,
szczyt pod
and
koniec
it reached its
tej
peak
epoki,
at the
kiedy
end
to
of this
właśnie
era.
połowa responsu, połowa wszystkiego, co jest zachowane, było napisane przez
So the
ostatnich
first
Gaonów Pumbedita,
responsa was
Rabba
attributed
Shirem
to Rav
i jego
Sheshna
syna Rabba
in the
Chaim
middle of the 7th
Gaonów.
century, whereas
O
most of
co
the responsa
chodzi
were
o
written by the last
historii?
Geonim, and that was
Teraz mamy
Rav
pytanie
Sherira and his
dla
son
Was.
Rav Hai,
Nawet
who
dawnych
lived
w
in the
aluzji,
10th century at the beginning of the
jak
11th century.
przesyłano te
So a
pytania?
technical question, how did they
Nie
send
było
the
mailów,
questions? You
ani
had no email,
WhatsAppu,
no
ani nic.
WhatsApp.
Jak przesłać takie
How would you
pytanie?
send such a question?
Jestem rabinem
So I'm
mężczyzną
a
w tych czasach.
man rabbi in those times. I'm
Jak
part of a
dostaje
Beit
się ten
Din.
mail?
So how to reach Sura or
wtedy do
Pumbedita or
Bagdadu.
Baghdad?
Przez karawany kupieckie.
O właśnie,
Through
aluzja była
trade
dobra. Przez
caravans,
karawany kupieckie. Więc pytanie do
commerce
Ateny
caravans.
było
So that's
kierowane
exactly
przez
right. So you
karawany
had
handlowe
trade
i
caravans,
wraz z dodatkiem
and that's how you
50-50, to
sent
jest
your
ważna sprawa,
questions along with the
na
fee, as we already said.
utrzymaniu W
It was a
rezultacie
payment to
docierały
support
takie
the
pytania
yeshiva. So
partialnie
the
i
questions would
ponieważ
arrive in
ile
batches
karawan handlowy
because
zbiera
a
sobie
trade
partię, ten
caravan
ktoś
would
zapyta,
just
ten ktoś
collect
zapyta, ten
various
ktoś zapyta
questions from
i jedzie
different
razem z tym
people from
wszystkim.
different places.
Niekiedy takie partie
So
liczyły
sometimes
ponad 100
such
zapytań
batches
naraz
included more
i
than a
obejmowały
hundred
bardzo
questions at a time,
szeroki
and they
okres
covers a
tematy
wide
i
range of topics.
odpowiadać na nie miał prawo
And
wewnętrzny
only the
Gaon,
Gaon
wieczny
himself, the
Gaon
head of the
Akademii
academy,
i my
had the authority
szczęśliwi
to
nie
answer
posiadali
these
takiej
questions. Other
jurisdykcji.
sages of the yeshiva did not possess
Czasami
such
kilka razy do
jurisdiction.
roku było
But
właśnie
a couple of
zgromadzenie
times a
całej
year, you had an
yeshify,
assembly of
które
the whole yeshiva,
omawiało
and
to
they were
albo inne
discussing
pytanie.
some of the questions.
Więc czasami nawet odpowiedzi były
So
formułowane w
sometimes the
liczbie,
answers
ale
were
nie zawsze.
formulated in the
Na
plural, but
początku,
not
jeżeli
always.
powiemy o tym, jak wyglądała odpowiedź, to najwcześniejsze odpowiedzi to
So the
odpowiedzi bardzo
earliest answers
krótkie.
were very
Te
short
odpowiedzi
ones.
zawierały może kilka
They were
słów
very
tak,
brief.
nie,
They would just
coś
say
takiego.
yes or no, for example.
Później z
But
każdą
then
epoką
with
odpowiedzi
each
stały się bardziej
generation, the
szerokie,
answers would
tłumaczące,
be more
pozycję
expanded. They would
rabina,
explain the
pozycję
position of the
Talmudu
rabbi, the position of the Gaon.
dotyczące
They
zasady
would explain
halachiczne,
halachic
na co się
regulations
opiera.
and the
Okej,
basis of the
ale
response.
teraz ciekawe, że powiedzieliśmy, jak te pytania
Okay, so we know how
wysyłane
the
do
questions were
gaonów.
sent
Jak z
to
powrotem
Gaons,
trafiali
and
do,
how did they get
do,
back? How did the answers get
do
back
osoby
to
pytającej?
the ones who asked the question? The
Tak
same
samo.
way as
Okay?
before.
Tak samo z karawanem handlowym.
So also
A to
with
też
the help of the
mówi nam
same
o tym,
trade
ile czasu
caravans.
zajmowało to, ponieważ karawan
So
jeden,
as we can imagine,
wszystkie
it took a
pytania,
long
później
time
ktoś
because you have a caravan who
karawan
has to
inny wróci
collect
z
all the
tymi
questions,
pytaniami.
then you have to wait for another
I
one to come back with
to
all
też
the
mówi nam
answers.
o tym, że ten karawan musi się gdzieś e,
And such a
przestawić
caravan
na
has
noc.
to stop somewhere
Wiemy, że w tych czasach nocą to się
to
niewiele
spend the night
używało. W
somewhere.
innych
As we know, in those
czasach
times,
ten
people would
karawan
not
to mogło
travel
być
at
kilka
night.
miesięcy
So
drogowych
sometimes such a
i
journey could
każdy z nich
last even a couple of
musiał
months.
zrobić przystanek
So they
gdzieś w
had to
jakimś
stop
mieście i
in
w tym
some
mieście
towns,
obowiązkowo była
and
kongregacja żydowska
there was
wspólnota.
always a Jewish
I jeżeli
congregation
wspólnota
in such a
żydowska
town.
już widzi ten
So if the
karawan,
Jewish
który bardzo
community
z
sees the
odpowiedzią na
caravan that's
jakieś
coming back with
halachiczne
the answer to
pytanie,
a halachic
no to
question,
można
then
sobie
they
powiedzieć
could say,
do tego karawanu, o słuchajcie,
listen, dear
możemy sobie zrobić
caravan, can
kopię,
you please let us make a copy of the answer?
bo może będzie takie
Because
jakieś
maybe
pytanie u
we will
nas.
have a similar question
I
at some
tak
point.
właśnie z tą całą wycieczką przez całą
So you
naszą
had a whole
mapę
journey across the whole
widzimy
map,
jeszcze
but
coś
then we see
ważnego.
something else that's
Każdy
very
raz,
important.
każda wspólnota, przez którą przechodził ten karawan,
Every community through
kopiowała
which the
sobie
traders
te
passed
odpowiedzi.
usually made
Czasami
their own
mamy bez
copies of
pytania
these
żadnego,
responses.
czasami nie mamy
Sometimes
pytania, mamy jedynie
they
odpowiedź.
copied
Ale po
just
co
the
kopiowali?
answer without the
Ponieważ tak
question.
sobie
And
stworzyli
why did they do
archiwum
it? Because that's
swoich
how they
halachicznych. Tak
created
sobie
an
stwarzali
archive of
archiwum, do którego
answers,
wybierali
and
każdy
they
raz, kiedy
could
mieli
take a look at
podobne
it if they
wyzwanie,
faced
podobną
similar
sytuację.
questions, similar
A
challenges.
jakiś tam, nie wiem, człowiek
So let's
rozwodził
say
się
someone is getting
z
a
żoną
divorce, but
poprzednią,
there is a
jeździ
problem with
samochodem,
the
a nie
previous
wiemy,
wife
czy
and the new
byliśmy tą
wife, and
drogę.
we don't know how to
Mieliśmy
handle
coś
it.
takiego w
And
naszym
someone would say,
archiwum.
we
Zajrzyjmy
had
tam.
such an answer in our
Gaon taki
archive.
odpowiedział tak, a to
A
jest
gown
super podobne
gave
do
such
tego.
and such
Więc Halacha
answer.
mówi tak. stwarzają
So now
się
they knew what the Kalachic response was. So that's how you had collections of responsa. They were called kuntras, which literally means a brochure or a
I
notebook.
są te zbiorniki bardzo ważne,
So these
zarówno
collections
jako
were very
źródźwigi, jako
important, both
archiwacji
for the
i
sake
warto
of
do tego, żeby
study
zrozumieć,
and
jak
for
wyglądało
archival
życie w tych czasach.
purposes.
Są źródłem historycznym. Po prostu nie wiem, jak
So these
ocenić to,
texts are a
ponieważ
great
inaczej nie
historical
moglibyśmy
source. So
zachować
without it, we could not
informacji o
have
życiu
so much
wspólnot-żydowskich w tym
information
czasie.
preserved about
Jeżeli karawan
Jewish life in those
miał
times.
z 5
So let's say the
przystanków, to
caravan
5
stopped
razy się
5 times.
skopiowało.
That means
I
that the
to znaczy, że
responsa was
mamy
copied
bardzo dużo
5 times.
kopii na
And
to
that means
samo,
that we
na tą
have
samą
many different
odpowiedź.
copies of
Tak?
the same answer.
Bardzo dzięki temu, że wszystko to było skopiowane, bardzo dużo
So,
tekstów
because
zostało
everything was
zachowane do
copied
naszych
multiple
czasów.
times, many of
I
the
na przykład
texts
w
are
Genizie
still
Kairskim
available
mieliśmy
today. For
tam
example, in the
teksty.
Cairo
Kair leżał na
Geniza,
głównym
you could
skrzyżowaniu
find many of
szlachów
them
handlowych.
because it
I to jest po
was
prostu fascynujące,
a place at a
ponieważ
major crossroads
większość
of trade routes.
osób, którzy
And that means
przenosili
that the trade
odpowiedzi,
caravans who
znajdowali
were
się właśnie
bringing
gdzieś
the
tam na
responsa
tych
with
terenach.
them passed through
I
that
właśnie dlatego się je
place.
responsy
And that's why you
przechowywały.
had many
Czasem każdy kuntras był
responsa
otoczony osobistym
stored back
indeksem
there.
treści. Każdy
Sometimes
człowiek,
each
który
contrast was
składał takie
accompanied
archiwum,
by a
który
special
pisał
index of its
o
contents.
całym, o co chodzi, albo
Sometimes
chcąc
you had
dowiedzieć,
a
jakie
summary and
tematy są zaznaczone.
explanation about the
I
contents of all the different answers.
więc ze względu na to mamy bardzo dużo zachowanych responsów do naszego czasu, tak?
So
I
many of
teraz
the
chcę powiedzieć,
responses have been
dlaczego
preserved.
ten gatunek jest bardzo
And
ważny.
now let me tell you
Dlaczego ten
why
gatunek jest
this
wyjątkowy.
genre is
I
so
o tym
important,
powiedzieć
why it's
mogę,
so
ponieważ
unique. And not
responsy
only in the
tworzyły
Geonim
się
period,
też
because
dalej.
next
Na przestrzeni
generations also
wieków,
wrote
aż do
responses
dzisiaj i dzisiaj
all across the
włącznie.
centuries, and
I
it's
słuchajcie,
happening
pytania
also today.
pojawiające się w responsach dotyczą problemów, które powstały w nowych okolicznościach.
So you would
Kwestii,
always get
których
new questions about
ani
new
Tanach, ani Talmud
circumstances. So you could not
późniejszych,
find
wszystkie te
the
epoki
answer in the
nie
Tanakh
omawiały.
nor the Talmud
Czyli
because they simply
pojawia
did
się
not
coś nowego
discuss
i
certain
trzeba
topics.
znaleźć
So
odpowiedź.
you have new
Rabin,
circumstances and you
czy
have to find an
uczony
answer. So you have
przywódca
rabbis or the
yeshiwy
head of a
musi
yeshiva
znaleźć
and they have to
odpowiedź.
find an answer.
Wiadomo, że kiedy wynaleziono druk,
So we know
wszystko się
that when printing
zmieniło.
was
Ludzie się
invented,
drukowali,
everything
wszystko
changed because
skopiowali
now
i wszystko było
everything was
wydawane
being printed,
przez
so it was
drukarnię.
copied and published by
Ale
the printing
po co
house.
tutaj mówię? Kiedy mówię, że pytania się zmieniają od czasów
So
Geonimu,
I'm trying to
to
say that
następnych
the
kolejnych
questions kept on
epok, które się
changing starting from the
pojawiały,
Geonim
to
period
znaczy, że
up until
halacha,
today.
prawo żydowskie
So that means that the
staje się
halacha,
nowe.
Jewish law,
Więc
keeps
jakie
on
nowe zagadnienia
developing.
otrzymujemy? Nie wiem,
What kind of
czy
new issues
na
can
przykład
arise?
dzisiejszy
Let's take a look at the
XXI wiek,
21st
sztuczne
century.
zapłodnienie.
So you
Jak
have
bardzo musi
artificial
szanować halachę,
insemination. So
prawo
what's the approach
żydowskie?
of the
O
Jewish
nie,
law of
rozumiem sprawę,
halacha
nie, w Tanachu
when it
nie,
comes
w
to
Misznie
artificial
nie, w
insemination?
Talmudzie nie.
You won't
W
find the
Talmudzie
answer
nikt
in
sobie
the
nawet
Tanakh, in
wyobrazić
the
nie mógł, że
Talmud,
będziemy
in the Mishnah. The
kwestionować takie
Geonim
pytania.
themselves could not imagine
Albo
that we'd be
prowadzenie
asking such questions.
samochodu w szabat.
Or the issue of
I
driving
to
a
jest
car
pytanie,
on
a ktoś
Shabbat.
mógłby powiedzieć czy
Could
dyskutować
they
o
have
tym?
discussed
Nie,
such
to
topics
jest coś
back then?
nowego.
Of
I
course
właśnie
not.
to jest
It's a new
pytanie
topic, a new
dla
issue.
responsy, że
And
właśnie
that's why you
trzeba,
have new responsum,
nie wiem,
tshuvot, shalot.
przeszczepy do serca, aparat, który podtrzymuje życie. Wszystko
All
to
different
to są
new
nowe
things.
zagadnienia, których nie
A
było wcześniej. I
pacemaker,
dlatego
life
potrzebujemy
support
tego gatunku.
equipment. You have many
Do
new
przykładu,
questions that
chcę
need
Wam
answers.
powiedzieć, po pierwsze, że responsy szerotu trzubot
So
dotyczą
shalot
nie jedynie
of tshuvot,
rabini
shut,
ortodoksyjni,
It's something that's not being written just by Orthodox rabbis. You have conservative and Reform rabbis who also write responsa. So, to give you an example, I'd like to tell you about a responsum that I wrote a couple of years ago. So, you have a question, then you have an answer and a justification for the answer, and then the conclusion, so a brief summary of the answer. So here is the question, שאלה.
שהתגיירה לפני כמה שנים, רוצה לציין את העלייה הראשונה שלה לתורה ולחגוג מעמד זה כבת מצווה. Kobieta, która kilka lat temu przeszła konwersję na
A woman
judaizm
who underwent Giur several years ago, she converted to Judaism, wishes to mark her first aliyah to the Torah and celebrate this moment as a bat mitzvah. At the time of her conversion, she chose a Hebrew name, and she intends to be called to the Torah under that name. However, she asks not to be called using the formulas. We can come up with a name. Let's say her name is Abigail. So she doesn't want them to say Abigail bat Abraham Avinu or Abigail bat Abraham Vesara. So the daughter of Abraham, our forefather, and the Abigail, the daughter of Abraham and Sarah. She doesn't want that because such formulations reveal personal information and implicitly disclose her biography. Namely, this shows the fact that she joined Judaism by choice. And this fact becomes known to everyone present, including those with whom she is only casually acquainted. This woman intends to continue studying Torah reading and to serve regularly as Baalat Kriya, a Torah reader at the synagogue. She therefore does not want each public reading of the Aliyah to include a reminder that she is a Giuret. So she doesn't want each of her public aliyah to include a reminder that she's a Gioret, that she converted to Judaism. So she also asks not to be called Plonit Bat Sarah when offering a Misha Berach, so a prayer for healing. Because in this blessing, this prayer, you state the name of your mother. So this woman asks, is it permissible for her to be called by the name of her Jewish grandfather, who was a Jew, even though it is not a Hebrew name? And can she be called by the name of the rabbi, a woman rabbi, who accompanied her through the process of accepting the mitzvot? What do you think about this question? So we have the full picture. We have a woman who underwent Giur conversion. She has a Hebrew Jewish name, but each time she's being called to the Torah, they say Abigail or Sarah or Rivka, but the daughter of Abraham Avinu or bat Abraham Vesara. And she doesn't want it. She doesn't want other people to hear that. She doesn't want for everyone to look at her as if she's the other, as she's not one of them. She doesn't want them to know that she underwent conversion. So she wants to be called by the name of her grandfather and by the name of the female rabbi. What do you think about that? If I recall in the Torah, it's written 36 times that you should not humiliate the convert in any way. So it seems to me that it's not really justified because there is no shame in that. Although, on the other hand, I heard that, for example, Kohanim cannot marry a convert. Yes, for example. Thank you, Tomek. Someone else?
Dominiko?
What do you think about this question?
Ja się zastanawiam, jak sformułować to, co
Dominika?
mam na myśli, ale właśnie odnosząc się do tego, co Tomek powiedział, jeżeli
Well,
ona czuje
as to
się
what Tomek
upokorzona
said,
w jakiś
well, if
sposób,
she feels
albo właśnie
humiliated
tą
in any
sytuacją,
way
albo
by the
wie, że
situation,
osoby, które są w
or if she
kongregacji,
knows that
będą
some
inaczej
of
na
the
nią
members
patrzeć
of
z
the
tego powodu,
congregation will
to
look at her
właśnie ja bym
differently
spojrzała
because
na
of
to
her
zalecenie, żeby nie
conversion,
upokarzać
then I
konwertyty,
would
jako
take
wskazanie do
the
tego, żeby
rule that you
poszukać
shouldn't humiliate the convert
alternatywnego
as a
rozwiązania.
suggestion that you should
I być może
look
spojrzeć
for
właśnie
an
na to
alternative
nie żydowskiego
solution,
dziadka
to
i
maybe
rabina
consider
jako
the name
osoby,
of her
które
Jewish
były takimi
grandfather and
rodzicami
the name of her
duchowymi
rabbi,
w
and
byciu
view them
Żydówką.
as her spiritual
Dziękuję,
parents who
Dominiko.
led her along the way of
Być może
becoming a Jewish woman.
Ty nas w samym pytaniu, tylko mi kiwnij, odczułaś, jaką odpowiedź chce otrzymać rabin, który zadaje to pytanie. Który
So I
transluje
think
to
that when you read the
I to jest
question, you can
jedna
already
z
sense
ciekawostek
what kind of answer the rabbi who asked it would like to get. And that's interesting about Shalot Vetshuvot, that sometimes even from the question, you can sense what kind of answer the rabbi would like to get. And very often, the Geonim will give the answer that the rabbi would like to get, but they will back it up with their own authority. So, going back to the question, we have a woman who feels bad about the fact that everyone will know about her conversion. And I was in Tel Aviv in one of the congregations there, and I remember that I simply felt bad during one Shachrit prayer. Out of 7 aliyot, you had 5 people, Ben Avram, Besara. And I felt bad because I don't have to know about it. I don't know these people. I'm seeing them for the first time. So why would I have this information? I don't want it. So I think that the woman who's asking this question, and it is a real question, it's a real life example. So how to reply? And here is what I said. We must acknowledge that in our time, liberal Judaism has placed converts in a complicated dilemma. In earlier eras, if a girl ascended to the Torah and the Gabbai recited his new Jewish name together with the name of his non-Jewish father, the entire community would immediately realize that the person before them had not been born into the people of Israel. So if you heard Eliyahu ben Konstantin, then you would hear that that is not a Hebrew name, that their father was not a Jew. So tradition offered a simple solution to call a convert Ben Avraham Avinu or simply Ben Avraham, since Abraham was the first theological convert and is therefore regarded as the spiritual father of all Gerim. In the past, small Jewish communities already knew who among them was a convert, but as both society and the structure of Jewish communal life changed over the centuries, this formula, Ben Avraham, served to proclaim loudly, before you stands someone, before you stands a Jew, do not remind them of their past, for from now on they are part of Israel like anyone else. So, at a certain point, you had to teach the entire community something. That's okay, maybe this person was not born as a Jew, but they are Ben Avraham. Remember, so each time we said Ben Avraham Avinu, that was a reminder for everyone that you have to treat them exactly the same way as if he was the son of Abraham. However, this solution fit its own historical moments. Today, it has lost its original purpose and at times has even produced the opposite effect. A person's choice to join the Jewish people is not always met with respect or pride today, especially in the Israeli context. Many contemporary converts prefer simply to blend into the community without publicly announcing that they were not born Jewish. In earlier generations, the name Abraham was such a common name that it drew little attention. But with the revival of Hebrew in the 20th century and the rise of new Hebrew names, it has become less common and more conspicuous. A second source of discomfort arises from the drive for gender equality, which led to the addition of the matriarch Sarah to the traditional formula, creating Ben Bat Avraham ve Sarah, or Bat Avraham ve Sarah. So here already you know what it means. So given these circumstances, it shouldn't surprise us that this Giuret feels a sense of awkwardness when she hears herself called to the Torah as Bat Avraham Vesara, and especially as Bat Avraham Avinu, Avraham our father, Vesara Imeinu, Vesara our mother. So such a formulation may not only hinder converts from participating fully and equally in communal life, but may also cause embarrassment, a sense that they don't want to be called up to the Torah. Of course, this does not mean that we encourage concealing one's conversion. On the contrary, information regarding a person's status must be available to the rabbis and communal leaders in private conversation. But it doesn't have to be available to everyone who's just sitting there and looking at her, and maybe it's for the first time. And at the same time, we are obliged to respect the feelings of converts and to avoid creating a situation in which they feel compelled to declare publicly, often before strangers, "Take notice, I was not born Jewish." Such a public self-disclosure may be compared to crying out, as it was done in the Torah, in Parashat Tazria, when you hear, "I am ritually unclean, tameh, tameh." And this is not the goal our tradition seeks to promote. So this response actually takes up many, many pages, a couple of dozen of pages, and it talks about the name as a symbol of belonging. It talks about the origins of the custom, and please note, I'm talking about custom, not about the law, because I found the information that being called Bat Avraham Vesara, Bat Avraham Avinu Vesara, is not mandated by Jewish law. So do converts actually know that it's not a law, it's not an obligation, it's just a custom? Well, not many people know about that, and it's an important information. I also mentioned that it's prohibited to cause suffering to the convert. Then I mention the respect towards parents and other relatives, not just to Jewish parents. Many texts describe the need to show respect to non-Jewish parents. I talk about the name of her grandfather and other non-Jewish names. So sometimes you had people among the Jewish people who were called by the name of their grandfather, or sometimes during after conversion, they would choose to be named or to be called up using the names of their non-Jewish parents. And then here is, after a detailed explanation, here is my summary of my answer to the convert.
hebrajskim imieniem, które wybrałaś w chwili swojego gijuru, swojej konwersji.
You have every right to be called to the Torah by the Hebrew name you chose at the time of your Giyur, and to be identified by the name of your grandfather, as well as by the name of the rabbi who accompanied you through the conversion process. However, before making a final decision, it's important that you speak personally with that rabbi to ensure that the use of her name will not cause her discomfort or feel like an intrusion into her personal space. In addition, you may study the sources and choose a spiritual figure with whom you feel a deep connection, who can serve as a model for you and as a spiritual mother. So this is the reply, the responsa that I believe the woman should get if she asked such a question. But I also included some additional explanations for rabbis. And the rabbis say something similar to what Tomek and Dominika said. We are commanded to love the ger, and this love manifests in many forms. One of these forms is attentiveness to the feelings of the convert, even if those feelings are subjective. Someone said, well, there is no shame in being a convert. But if someone feels subjectively that revealing such an information makes them feel as the other, then we are obligated to do everything we can to make it easier for such people to integrate with the community. We have to fight with all types of discrimination and to help cultivate a genuine sense of belonging to the people of Israel. It's important that the Giyuret receive a full picture of all available options. She may be called to the Torah without mentioning any parents' names at all. This option is available in our tradition. If she nevertheless wishes for names to be mentioned, there are no halachic restrictions preventing her from choosing, for example, two female or two male names. Let's say if she was brought up in such a family. However, if such a form is not customary in a given community, the rabbi should tactfully inform the woman that deviating from the familiar practice may draw questions or unwanted attention. Allow me also to add an additional explanation as to why it is permitted for a convert to be called to the Torah by the names of their non-Jewish parents, so the mother and father who brought them up. It's sometimes claimed that the non-Jewish parents of a convert are not part of the praying community of the Jewish community and therefore do not deserve to be mentioned in this context. But does it truly matter whether those parents are physically present in the synagogue or not? Does it make any difference that they are not part of the community? After all, Jews by birth also assent to the Torah using the names of their parents, even when those parents have long passed away. A convert's choice to be called by the names of their biological parents may reflect a deep sense of personal attachment and gratitude. Moreover, such a choice can strengthen the convert internally at the moment of ascending to the Torah, getting an aliyah, a moment that itself symbolizes a renewed Sinai revelation in which they now take part. Every time we read the Torah, it's a renewed revelation. So if a convert wants to, even symbolically, to bring their parents into this spiritual experience, this revelation, it should be regarded as a sincere emotional act of profound respect and love. Halacha keeps on developing, keeps on changing. It keeps on asking us new questions, we always seek new answers. So that's what I wanted to tell you about today. And now we have some time for questions or thoughts, reflections. Thank you very much for your attention.